Here we go. Which did you press? Press this one? This one? Okay. All right. Now, if you go to the new European Bauhaus website, you're going to find, amongst all the various bits of material you'll find there, a statement of these three objectives that we'd like to achieve with regard to the practice or the creation of architecture. The first is we want to be sustainable, which is something we've been talking about a lot for quite some time, and even though the term itself mightn't be absolutely crystal clear, I think we all know what that means. We also want to design for inclusion, which is a little trickier, I think, than the word suggests. We might get onto that a little bit later. And there is also an aspiration to design something which is aesthetically pleasing, and that's what I'd like to be able to address in this paper. So my question is there enough clarity around the whole notion of the aesthetic to be able to move forward in any meaningful way, especially if we want to address issues like sustainability and inclusion? And my argument is no, there isn't a sufficient investigation around this whole area of aesthetics, and perhaps the advent of the new European Bauhaus and maybe conferences like this one here will provide a platform for people like us, architects and others, to be able to start to talk about this in some meaningful way. Now, there's just a quick aside before I start. There are some people, and perhaps even more than some, who have a difficulty with the very idea of an architectural aesthetic. So that for people like this, and I've heard this from students in my own college and in other colleges that I've been involved in the past month, in recent months and years, that on the one hand, obviously there is a desire to create a building that is in some way beautiful, to make a beautiful architectural intervention. On the other hand, there is a popular neo-Marxist critique which asks the question, do we need an aesthetic at all? Because if we're going to have an aesthetic in our architecture, who gets to choose it? So what I'm hoping to be able to do in this paper here is also maybe suggest a kind of a path we might be able to take where we can negotiate this question. Now, to start off with, I suppose it might be useful to work with a definition of the term aesthetic. And for that, I'm going to suggest that we go back to Kant's reflection on judgment. That's Immanuel Kant. I'm not sure if I understand fully what it is that he's saying, but I do think, if I'm right, that he does bring us to a useful position that's going to help us out in our argument today. So Kant argued that we have a capacity to understand concepts, and we also have an ability to reason. In other words, if I see a dead body on the ground and there's a smoking gun over here, my reason might step in and lead me to a kind of a conclusion. And he suggests that the capacity for judgment is the thing that helps us to mediate between our reasoning and our understanding of concepts. And it's a tricky idea to get your head around. I'm not sure I do completely, but I do think that it's a useful place that he brings us to, because he sort of abstracts the idea of the aesthetic and isolates it from this notion of a prejudicial style or a prejudicial architectural language. Now we're talking about something else, something that I think maybe we might be able to all agree on, and it's useful. Now, I was going to going to start talking about my own definition of what I think an aesthetic might be, but I'll run out of time if I do that, so I'll just press on. The only thing that I want to stress is that I think with Kant's view, and certainly with mine, an aesthetic is not a style or a language. It's some other form of judgment. Okay, so let's have a look at some sources of architectural aesthetics. Well, I think it's fair to say that these may include, I'm just going to cite a couple, not all of the aesthetics that exist, but I think it's fair to say that it would include Alberti's concept of what proportion and harmony can do in architecture. And this is his San Andrea in Mantua, illustrating that very point. And then I think we find it in the San Savino in Venice, which of course is 100 years later, and maybe Alberti might argue the point and say this isn't what he meant, but I think we can agree that we're talking about the sense of the aesthetic that Alberti's describing is evident in this building too, and perhaps also evident in a building which is very different from Alberti's own architecture, and this is the Katsura Palace in Japan. This sense of proportion and harmony, although it's a very different building, the aesthetic of proportion and harmony is very much to do with our enjoyment of the Katsura Palace. Now, there are other forms of aesthetic too. We all know that there's an aesthetic that's related to the material. So when Louis Kahn said, he asked the brick, what would it like to be? And the brick said, I'd like to be an arch. And so here we have, if you like, the concept of the brick and the reasoning of the arch, and somewhere in between this notion of the aesthetic of what's going on here reveals itself to us, and it's a little bit elusive, but we do know what it is. We sort of feel it. Now, Kant, of course, or Kahn wasn't the first person to understand the beauty or the aesthetic of working with the brick. This is one of the Hindu temples in Sri Lanka from, I think this is 2nd century BC. I'm not going to try to pronounce it, it's very difficult, but we know which building we're talking about. And even before that, long before that, it seems to me that going back as far as Mohenjo-daro, people understood the idea that when you work with the brick and you do it in a particular way, you end up with something that's aesthetically very pleasing. Now, the question then I have is, can we find another source of aesthetic inspiration which might in some way address the notion of inclusion? And I'm going to suggest that a possible source for this type of aesthetic might be found in the concept of ritual. Now, I'm going to try and explain this. So, architecture critics, the well-known critics of the 20th and 21st century, they tend to describe the effect of the work of architecture, the building, the mise-en-scène, on the individual. That is to say, on the fully defined, articulated self, how I relate to the work of architecture. Now, I'm going to cite, such a critic would be Roger Scruton, and I'm only just citing him because I happened to be reading him when I was putting this paper together, but any number of other writers could easily be substituted to make this point. So this is Scruton, though, where he's describing the effect of the architecture of Chartres Cathedral on the visitor. I'm not going to read it all. He says, the experience of Chartres is the apprehension of a divine light penetrating all things, all matter made permeable to the soul. And he says that nothing short of a visit to Chartres will suffice. So essentially what he's saying, go to Chartres, perhaps on a quiet day when the sun is shining, sit in the pew and contemplate the beauty of the light falling on the stone. Now, I think that is true. That is a fair way to understand the architecture of Chartres, but only up to a point. I think there is a much more important aspect of the structure's impact on the visitor that just isn't really included in Scruton's argument, and that is that the full architectural significance of one of the great French cathedrals is only really revealed when we visit during an important ceremonial function, when usually there's a procession going on or there's the playing of music. It's a very sensual experience. Now, when we're having this ritual architectural experience at Chartres or any of these other wonderful cathedrals, at some level, I'm not responding to what's going on as an individuated self, as a fully defined, fully contained self. At some level, my personal response is inseparable from the fact that I am a member of the hive. Now, of course, when I am the member of the hive, part of the congregation, if you like, during one of these great ceremonies, I am two things at the same time. I am my own individual self, if you like, sort of watching me being part of a larger group, the congregation or the hive. But I am also responding as part of the hive. This duality exists, it's there, and I think we've all experienced it. So in this reading of ritual, it'd be fair to say that St. Peter's, the Vatican in Rome, it's only ever a piece of architecture when a pope has died and another is being elected. In other words, St. Peter's is sort of sitting there for 20 or 25-year periods, being kind of interesting in the way that Scruton suggests, but only really a piece of architecture when it's called on to fulfill its full function. Now, this is an exaggeration, of course, and it doesn't only occur in a Catholic form of worship. It's available in all the major religious traditions, I think at least. So, for example, anybody who's been to the Blue Mosque in Istanbul on a Friday afternoon during prayers will know that something kind of similar is going on, and I'm sure the same thing happens in the Hindu and Jewish and all the other faiths. And there are, of course, other, refer to this as an uppercase R ritual, but there are other uppercase R rituals. Probably the big one in modern times, in contemporary times, is the visit to the sporting event, and maybe in particular the soccer match. And of course there's the theatre, there's the street, and I would suggest that a visit to the Gran Via, for example, here in Madrid, is something akin to a ritual experience. I mean, we might be going there to buy or to conduct business, but everybody knows that there's something about visiting a street like the Gran Via and other great streets like it in other parts of the world, Upper Fifth Avenue or whatever, that is something about the ritual of what's going on. And we find it with the Parliament. But there are also lowercase r rituals, and these are the ones that I'm interested in. So a lowercase r ritual. So for example, if we all decided that we were going to meet this evening to eat together, to dine together, we could all, of course, come along with our sandwiches wrapped in plastic and just unwrap them in the courtyard and all just stand around talking to each other. But that's not typically what we do. Typically what we do is we choose to go to a restaurant because we're going to participate in the dining ritual. And we go to the restaurant and the maitre d' meets us at the door. He's got his napkin and he makes a fuss of who we are and he brings us to our table. And hopefully it's a really good table and all the other diners are looking at us and they're kind of excited, and we're looking at them, we're kind of excited. Maybe we've done something interesting and we're out celebrating. And it's all the ritual of dining. And I'd suggest as well that this doesn't only occur, obviously, with restaurants and dining. I mean, it happens at the level of the house. There's a ritual of living in the house. The house is the place of ritual. It's not a machine for living in. Now, I argue that in every instance of our daily interaction with the work of architecture, it's the accommodation of the ritual that counts, and not other concerns to do with structure or architectonics or use of materials. It's to do with the ritual. And if the architect's proposal permits the proper functioning of the ritual, whether it's a capital R or a lowercase r, then there is satisfaction. We find satisfaction in that. Now, I'm about to wrap up, and I'll just finish on my point, which is that as the human hive becomes ever more diverse, ever more interesting, I'd even go so far as to say ever more kind of fabulous, then the possibilities for aesthetic inspiration deriving from more complex ritual behaviours, well, they become even richer, at least in my view. So I'd argue that an architectural approach which strives to address inclusion in a meaningful way should therefore begin with an examination of the parallel ideas of ritual that are in the community and informing the program. So say, for example, our job is to design a community building, then our job is to go into a community which is going to be a diverse community, and we begin to develop an understanding of all the rich traditions of thinking about the ritual of the town hall or the community building that are out there in the client body running in parallel. And what we do is we take each of these ideas on board and treat them equally and with an equivalence. And I think if we do that, we have the possibility exists for designing for inclusion. And that's it. Thank you very much.